Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
When I first began to move from being an evolutionist to being a creationist, and my dental students had challenged me, we began to look at the assumptions behind evolution, which I had never looked at before, was never taught. Now, an assumption is a guess. It might be a good guess. It might be an educated guess, but it's still a guess. All right, so the first assumption behind evolution is that what they call spontaneous generation occurred. Now, all that is when they say spontaneous generation in this context, all that means is somehow dead chemicals came to life. There was no life, and then all of a sudden, in some sort of primordial ooze, here comes something that's alive and is somehow able to reproduce itself. That's called spontaneous generation. Now, evolutionist Kirkett says that's an assumption. Now, why is that an assumption? Well, because they can't make it happen. With all of the sophisticated laboratory equipment we have today, we have every kind of chemical you can think of. We have every kind of powerful computer. So on the campuses where I go, I'll say to the professors that are arguing against creation and for evolution, I'll say, okay, look, you've got those computers, you've got the laboratory equipment, you've got every chemical, mix them up, make it come to life. That's all you have to do. Because evolution assumes that that happened at one time in the past. All right, now, that's probably the first major assumption, that dead things can come to life. The second major assumption they make is, most of them make, there may be a few that don't think this way, but most of them say, that only ever happened once. So now you have the dead chemicals, somehow they come, now they're alive, but it only happened once. Now, why would they say, and why would they assume, which they do, and that's how Kirkett words it, their second big assumption is, hey, it only happened once, life from dead chemicals. Now, why would they say that? Well, because it is the probability of that happening is zero. I mean, just to get an amino acid to become a protein, let's say a simple protein, 200 amino acids. That would be a very simple protein. The probability of these amino acids, all left-handed, now keep in mind, if you throw in a right-handed one, you have to start all over again, all right? The probability of amino acids getting together, bonding together to become a simple protein is something like 1 to the 141st power. That's a minus 141st power, but so we're not thinking in fractions. That would be a 1 with 141 zeros after it. Well, some people believe there's only 1 to the 80th power electrons in the whole universe. So there aren't even enough possible ways to mix things to come up with a simple protein. And then you would have to somehow get only the left-handed amino acids. All right, so that's one of the reasons they say, well, it only happened once. Now, that's where they get their tree of life, where they say, oh, look at this. We have this one little cell, and now here comes everything out of this one cell. Here's your plants over here, and all your plants branching off, and over here's all your animals and your fish and all these kinds of things over here. But that's an assumption. But once they make those assumptions, then another assumption is that viruses, plants, and bacteria and animals, they're all related. So, you look at your plant and you say, well, Uncle Harry, how are you doing here? You see, because they're all related. We all came from that first cell, but that's an assumption. Now, what they do in the textbook is they'll draw these pictures of life, and they'll have a horse, and they'll have a fern, and they'll have a coelacanth fish down here, and they'll have man way up here, and then some pine trees over here. But they hook them up with lines, but there's nothing on the lines. Well, why is there nothing on those lines? Well, because those are the missing links. There's nothing there because there's nothing there. But that gives you a picture in your head. Oh, you see, these things are all connected. They're all hooked up. But it's really a fraudulent thing to do because there's nothing on those lines because there's nothing there. So it's an assumption that there's things in here, in between, that hook them up. They aren't hooked up. All right. Well, then they say that reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians, they're all related. The fish came out of the water, became the amphibians in the water and out of the water, became the reptiles, which became the birds and the mammals. That is an assumption. And that's what Dr. Kirkett says. That's a guess because we don't know, because we can't make it happen. For instance, if evolution is true, Then if reptiles, let's say, became birds, that's what evolution taught me, reptiles first, then birds. So we have a reptile, cold-blooded, dense bones, that's going to evolve into a bird, warm-blooded, hollow bones. Now, is there any such thing as, let's say, a lukewarm-blooded, semi-dense boned creature that's in between reptile and bird? No, no. You either have a reptile or you have a bird. And well, what about Archaeopteryx? Oh no, the leading evolutionary thinkers now are telling us, no, that's a pure bird. That's a pure bird. As a matter of fact, they have birds now that they have found that are before the Archaeopteryx. And so, what is evolution then? Well, it's a faith system because it's based on assumptions that even today, the leading evolutionary thinkers of our day, they cannot hook up these vast distances between various types of creatures. Oh, well, you see, those are the transitional forms, now that's the new name for the missing link, you see. It doesn't sound as missing if we call it a transitional form. And so, well, those are the transitional forms. Now, we haven't found them yet, but we will. Give us enough time, we will. Well, what they are finding with the time they have is, and especially now with things like molecular biology, where they can actually go in and look at the molecules. One quick example. Ramapithecus was supposed to be an ancestor of man. It was assumed to be our ancestor. And then you have Vincent Sarich out there at Berkeley, and he does the molecular work, an evolutionist. And oh no, Ramapithecus is an ancestor of an orangutan. Well, it's still in some textbook as an ancestor of man, when it's been proven at the molecular level it has nothing to do with man. So this whole idea of Big Bang macroevolution is based on a whole series of pure assumptions. And so evolution then, in my opinion, and I was an evolutionist for the first half of my life, it is a faith system. If we're talking Big Bang to molecules to life to man.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
If you take an egg and you put it in warm water, you will see bubbles coming out. Now, why do you see those bubbles? Well, because there's little holes all through the egg shell, about 10,000 actually in a chicken shell. Those holes are there so that the chick can breathe, because that's where he gets his air, through those holes, so they can get the waste out of the shell, because the chick, as he develops, is going to eat the yolk, and the yolk, as he burns it up, there's waste products, there's water and different things given off, and he has to be able to get the waste out of the shell, or for instance, just the amount of water that's given off, he would drown right there in the shell. How do you explain all the intricate mechanisms and the perfect timing that it takes for an egg to develop, making this whole thing happen? Because every step of the way, the chick would be dead. Everything has to be done on a particular day and in a particular order, and the timing has to be exactly right, or you have a dead chick. If you have ever boiled an egg or eaten a hard-boiled egg, you'll notice when you peel the egg, there's like that little membrane in there. And that membrane has to be there, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But on one end of the egg, it's flat, and it looks like the chicken didn't quite fill the egg. Well, that's a special place. That's called the air sac. And so now we take all these parts and we put them together, and we have this little fertilized egg, and now this little chick is developing. By the 5th day, its little heart is pumping. Blood vessels have grown out of the chick. 2 of them go up, hook into the membrane, and those are the ones that it's going to breathe through. It'll get its air through that. The air comes through the pores or the holes in the shell up to the membrane, and then the membrane transfers the oxygen to the artery, the vein that goes into the chick, and then the other vessel that hooks into that gets rid of the waste, and so there's a process there of things coming in and things going out of the shell. 2 more blood vessels hook into the yolk, and that's the way the chick eats. And as he lives in this shell, he begins to get to where he's too big and he can't get enough air, and it's now the 19th day. Now, during this time, he has grown a little tooth on top of his beak. It's called the egg tooth. Now, most of us grow our teeth inside our mouth, not on our beak, but the little chick has this little egg tooth. And on the 19th day, he takes that and he pokes a little hole into that flat end of the egg where the air is. That's called the air sac. And now he has 6 hours to breathe. Now, if we're swimming and we're on the bottom of the swimming pool and we've run out of air and we get up to the top and oh, I just made it. We usually just sit there and lean there and get some good air and breathe a while. Well, not the chick, because if he got into that air sac, I mean, he's going, I can't get enough air, and he pecks into that on the 19th day, not one day sooner or one day later or it's dead. It's the 19th day, goes into that sac. Now he's got 6 hours. Now, is he going to just sit there and breathe that air, or is he going to say, I need to do something else with this air, which is what he says. I've got to get a little hole and use this 6 hours of air. I got 6 hours to peck a little hole through the shell. And now he breathes from the 19th to the 21st day through this little hole in the shell. On the 21st day, that's the day he breaks out of the shell. Now, in the meantime, the systems that hook into the membrane and the systems that hook into the yolk, all of those little vessels, they begin to disattach or detach themselves. And when he comes out of the shell, sometimes he might have a blood vessel hanging on him somewhere or something like that. But the fact is, these things, it's like he's dropped his spacesuit off and he is ready to go. And so he comes out of that shell on the 21st day, but every single step along the way had to have perfect timing. It had to be done exactly right. And when he comes out, he's a discrete entity. There's no mistake. This is a chick. All we see in all of nature, in the fossil record and in living creatures, is just discrete, identifiable. We can label them. That's a cow. That's a chicken. And so I think that's more evidence that God made everything, including little chicks, just exactly like they are.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
The woodpecker is a very special little bird. The beak of a woodpecker is like industrial strength. It is stronger than other birds' beaks. He has special feet. Most birds have 3 toes out the front, 1 toe out the back. Woodpecker has 2 toes out the front, 2 toes out the back, and that's so he can climb around on a tree trunk, a vertical tree trunk, right side up, upside down, sideways. He can crawl any way he wants to. He has special tail feathers. His tail feathers are different than other birds' tail feathers. They're more resilient, they're spongy, and they're very strong and tough because he tripods himself with his 2 feet and his tail feathers so that he grabs a hold of that tree, fans out his tail feathers, and then bangs his head into the tree. Now, you would think that a woodpecker would go home every night and say to Mrs. Woodpecker, oh, I got this headache. I was banging my head on a tree all day. But he doesn't. Why? Well, because God made him with special equipment. For instance, between his beak and his skull, there's a piece of cartilage. It acts as a shock absorber. His skull is the thickest bone per body weight of any creature. As a matter of fact, brain surgeons study the brains of woodpeckers, how they're hooked in there and everything, to help them with like trauma people in accidents, that they need to put their brains back in there. And so they study woodpeckers. The woodpecker, with his strong skull and his shock absorber and his strong beak and his tail feathers and his feet, he's all ready to go except for one thing. Once he drills his hole, he's got to get that bug out of the tree because that's lunch. All right, well, how's he going to do that? Well, most birds, their tongue goes right to the tip of the beak. A woodpecker's tongue goes as much as 10 inches out of his beak. Now, why? Well, because he's going to drill the hole, find the bug tunnel down in the tree, stick his tongue down in the tunnel, and drag the bug out. Now, you would have to say, could I stick my tongue down a hole in a tree and drag a bug out? Of course not. Well, how does the woodpecker do that? Well, God made the woodpecker with little barbs on the tip of his tongue. And he will literally stab that bug larva down in there because it doesn't want to come out. But in case that's not enough, he has a little glue factory in his tongue that manufactures exactly, precisely the right glue to stick to the bug, but it doesn't stick to his beak. And so he pulls that bug into his mouth. Now we have a problem, if evolution is true. Let's say over hundreds of thousands of years, this woodpecker got all this equipment, and then he glues his tongue to a bug, and he swallows the bug. What just happened to his tongue? He just swallowed his tongue. You know, he dies, he just strangled himself, okay? But he doesn't. Why? Well, because as he brings the bug into his mouth, he has another little factory that manufactures the solvent to dissolve the glue. So he dissolves the glue, loosens up the bug, swallows the bug. God made him that way. Woodpeckers, when they peck, they open their eyes between each peck, and they aim their beak, they focus, they aim their beak, they close their eyes, and then they hit the tree. So you hear a woodpecker out there, he's going, drrr, drrr, Every time you hear that, drrrt, in between each peck, he opens his eyes, focuses, aims his beak, hits the tree. Why? Well, they used to think it was just to keep the wood chips out. But now the scientists have measured the force of the impact of the woodpecker's head against the tree, and the force is so great that if he did not close his eyes, he would pop his eyeballs out. So I would say, have you ever seen a blind woodpecker? No, they never miss. They never miss, okay? Now, one special woodpecker, the European green woodpecker. I think he's unique in all the animal kingdom. I don't know for sure, but I think he might be. His tongue is different than any other tongue, as far as I know. Our tongue starts in the back of our throat, comes up and out the front. His tongue starts in the back of his throat, goes down the throat, comes out the back of his neck, up over the top of his head. It's under the skin, comes out a little hole between his eyes, goes in one of his nostrils, and then comes out of his beak. And you would have to say, now how does that evolve? I've asked evolutionists that question. I've said, now you tell me, how and where did that tongue come from? They don't have a clue. They can't tell me. I'm saying, well, you're telling me that this bird evolved from some other creature, but there's no other creature that we know of with a tongue like that. How did that happen? They don't have any idea. I think there are very bright people who study science and do a good job of it, but all of a sudden they get to a point where they have to decide, did this thing happen over long periods of time somehow? Or, boy, it sure looks like it could have happened just bang, just like it is. And then, if they discover, hey, I have no way of describing this thing in terms of evolutionary science, they're faced with the other option, which is maybe a designer and a creator, and they say, I don't want to go that way, okay? So they suppress that evidence. And so many of the things that I studied, we had to search just to find information on them because they are not in the textbooks. They just don't put them in because they have no way to explain it. And so they just ignore it.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
Oh, missed him. Those dragonflies are really fast. You ever wonder why they call them dragons? It's because of their fierce jaws. Check this out.
The dragonfly is a remarkable hunter. It can swoop down on its prey at speeds over 20 miles per hour. Its wing design gives it incredible flying ability. And with eyes that can spot its prey at over 40 feet, very few will escape.
A dragonfly, they live in the water as the larvae. And they might be in the water for 1 to 2 years as larvae. And they're down there and they're eating little fish and they'll eat tadpoles. And you know, sometimes there's a bunch of tadpoles here and here comes a dragonfly larva and it catches one and eats it. And that little one that it is eating puts out some kind of a signal that makes the other tadpoles in the area turn a little different color so that they can swim faster and get away from a dragonfly larva. I mean, no way that evolution has the answer for those kinds of things. Sikorsky, that invented the helicopter, it is said that he studied dragonflies and got his ideas for helicopters. Well, a dragonfly has 2 sets of wings, and the front set of wings, if he's flying forward, that will give him his lift, and the back set of wings gives him his propulsion, what pushes him. But they can fly backwards. And when a dragonfly flies backwards, now the back set of wings lifts and the front set of wings pushes. So he is absolutely reversing what the muscles do when he flies backwards, and he can do it in an instant. He can fly up, stop, and fly back. As far as I know, they're the only insect that when they turn, their whole body turns. So they're like, if they're flying straight, you look, their whole body's straight, their abdomen's straight. Now they're going to bank around a turn. That means that the upper wings or the outside wings, compared to the inside wings on the curve, they're doing 2 different things now. So he's working his wings in 2 different ways on the opposite sides of his body. And the wings themselves, why don't those little frail wings on a dragonfly just collapse? You can see right through them. They're like paper thin. God built little channels through those wings that might be 1/100th of an inch. They add all kinds of strength to it. They have cells that are thicker at the tips of the wings so that when it is flying, the wings don't flutter. That's a miracle. I don't know how else to explain that.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
So in the fall of 1971, I went to Baylor in Dallas and gave my first lecture. It was on the evolution of the tooth. And I talked about how these fish scales gradually migrated into the mouth and became teeth. And a couple of my students came to me after class that day and said, Dr. Martin, have you ever investigated the claims of creation science? Well, that was 1971. I'd never even heard of it. And so I'm thinking to myself, where are these guys coming from? I've never heard of this. And so I said, sure, I'll look into this with you. And I'm thinking, kind of as a cocky young professor, I'll blow these guys away. Well, they asked me to start studying the assumptions that the evolutionists make. And in all my years, 8 years of scientific education, I had never had a single professor tell me about an assumption. And so we started looking at the assumptions, and I began to realize they're making some claims here that really the assumptions aren't valid. And then they asked me to start studying some animals and see if I thought that animal could evolve. Well, the first thing that we really studied together was this little bug called a bombardier beetle. And this little insect, it's about a ½ inch long, and it mixes chemicals that explode. So I began to think, okay, now how would that evolve? Let's say if evolution is true, and you're evolving along here, and you don't have a defense mechanism, because that is the defense mechanism of the bug. So if evolution is true, it had to somehow evolve that. So let's say it's coming along here. Well, the first time it evolves the explosion, what does it do to the bug? Boom, you just splattered your bug, okay? So splattered bug pieces don't evolve. So I thought, how could this have happened? Well, it doesn't blow itself up. It has another little factory inside itself that manufactures chemicals. A chemical acts as a catalyst so that when you squirt that chemical in with these other chemicals that are like in neutral, you get your explosion. Well, the first time it manufactured that little chemical, here it goes again, blew itself up again. But it doesn't. Why? Well, because it has like an asbestos-lined firing chamber. And even then it would blow itself up if it didn't have somewhere for the explosion to go. So it has twin tail tubes. And it can aim these tail tubes all the way up, out the side, out the front. Let's say a spider is coming up toward its side and it doesn't have time to turn around and shoot. It can just take its little gun turret and aim it out there and shoot. The explosion on this little bug, all you hear, if you're listening as a human, you hear this pop. But scientists have now put that explosion in slow motion. And it's like about 1,000 sequential little explosions, but they're so fast, all we hear is one pop. And so you think, well, now, why would that be? Well, that was a curious thing for the scientists that study this little bug. A lot of them at Cornell University, some other places. And what they discovered was that if it was just one big pop, the little bug, if he's shooting like a spider, let's say over here, and he goes room, bang, and shoots it, he's going to pop himself right out of there. It's like lighting a burner on a jet engine, so he's out of there. But as long as it is a sequential explosion with his little legs, he can hang on. How would evolution explain a sequential explosion? This little bug messes with all the theories of evolution. There is no way a slow, gradual process is going to produce this bug. There's no way even the newest theories of evolution, like punctuated equilibria, which means evolution happens very fast. Well, there's no way that will explain this little bug. I began to realize, how could this particular little animal, for instance, evolve? It needed all of its parts. It needed everything there all at once, or you just don't have the animal. And my stomach started to churn, if I really want to be honest. And my wife would tell you, my stomach churned for 5 years. It took a 5-year struggle for me to begin to flip the way I think, from thinking in an evolutionary way to thinking in more this animal or little creature, little bug, whatever, was created fully formed, just like it is. Because that went against everything I'd ever learned.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com. The Pacific golden plover is a shorebird which lives in the great Arctic North. Weighing only ½ pound, it lays about 4 eggs that hatch in 24 days. After having its chicks, this bird embarks on a courageous and Herculean migration.
How does evolution explain how a migratory animal gets from where he is in the summer to where he is in the winter? Usually the explanation is you have this certain kind of bird, and he grows in Texas. And then one winter, Texas is a cold winter. So he decides, you know something, I'm heading for Mexico. So he flies a few hundred miles south, and it's a little nicer down here. And then he comes back to Texas in the summer, but it's a especially hot summer. So he decides, you know, I think I'm going to go to Kansas. So he flies north, looking for a little cooler weather. And then each year he might go a little further south, a little further north, until they get all the way up to the Arctic and all the way down in South America. Well, this little bird breaks that rule. First of all, it's a very small bird, about the size of a dove, and it's not a swimmer, and it lives up in the Arctic, in Alaska actually. They leave their young and then fly to Hawaii for the winter. Now, when it leaves Alaska, it has an 88-hour flight nonstop because there's no land in between. 3 days and 4 nights nonstop. How does it do that? Well, these little birds begin to eat a lot, and they gain about 70 grams of burnable energy. And here's the problem. We got an 88-hour flight, and they burn right at 1 gram per hour. Well, that only gives them 70 hours worth of fuel. So they're going to drop into the ocean as non-swimmers a few hours short of Hawaii. Well, then how do they get there? Well, because God made them so they fly in formation, and they alternate leaders, and so they break the airwaves there, so it makes it easier, like geese fly in formation. And that cuts the energy that it takes to fly.
It's not uncommon for birds of that size to lose 50% of their total body weight, and that's fat being burned up along their migration routes. It's an incredible feat. If you can imagine a 100-pound human losing 50 pounds in a 5-day period as they traveled across the world. It's just something that mammals can't do.
And so, only God could do that because the evolutionary explanation doesn't fit, because there's no way they could go a little bit each year, a little bit further south, plop, their fish bait. Okay, so they can't do it. So the evolutionary explanation doesn't work on them. There is another interesting thing, and that is the parents have their eggs, the babies hatch, but then the parents fly to Hawaii. Now the young are here, and they're going to keep eating and growing and gaining strength to get their 70 grams of fat built up, and then they take off for Hawaii, but they've never been there before. So how do they navigate? How do they know where to go? Nobody knows for sure. And if they miss it, even if some side wind would catch them and start blowing them off course, they still get there.
And they can arrive at the exact same location every year within an area the size of this room, and they do this over thousands of miles.
How do these animals get from here to there? The scientists are still trying to figure that out. Same thing with the homing pigeons. These little birds can find their way back home to their very spot where they need to go from almost anywhere in the world. Now, there are these huge areas that they've never flown over before.
So they use many means, and we don't even really know what they all are and how they do it. But when we take them out and release them, they'll circle for a while and get oriented and head for home. It's amazing.
What is guiding them across these areas, and what is built into them that God has done? I think that's the only way to describe this. God has made these little creatures so they can find their way over totally unknown territory to them.
Exploration Films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet. Exploration Films. Check us out on the web at explorationfilms.com.
The whole idea that ideas have consequences, look at our culture. Look at what's taught in our schools, our universities. We even have things that are taught that aren't even true, and they're known to be not true. There are things like Haeckel's embryo pictures that are still in current textbooks. And there's all these little embryo pictures of horse and cow and pig and human, and they all look exactly alike. Well, that was proven to be a fraud back in about 1884, and it's still in the textbooks. And then you have things like the peppered moth. Well, what's going on here? You've got these peppered moths that are growing on these living on these tree trunks, and during the Industrial Revolution, apparently the tree trunks got covered with dust, and Now all of a sudden the birds can't see these light-colored ones. They just kind of blend in, but they're eating all the dark-colored ones, and that just proves natural selection. Well, the fact is that whole thing was a fraud. Those moths don't even grow on tree trunks. They don't land on tree trunks. They live up in the top of the trees. And so the birds can't be eating them off the tree trunks when they don't even land on tree trunks. And so those pictures are still in the textbooks. Okay, by the way, that was exposed in 1999 publicly. And so we have a system of delusion that is propagated out there that most people don't know, and they don't even know. But there's some people that do know, and they just keep doing it. When we have people like Carl Sagan that go on television and they'll say, evolution is no longer a theory, it is a proven fact. That is baloney, and he knew that. But that's called propaganda. When a distinguished man with a PhD degree and a white lab coat gets up in front of the average Joe six-pack and says, we have proven evolution is true with our science. Well, first of all, he's not talking science, because you can't prove macroevolution with science. It is more a philosophy. The fact is, evolution is not a proven fact.
Exploration films, where curious truths and uncommon minds meet.